context, the context into which things are put. This includes reveals, or out-of-context experiences, spatially. And, in terms of temporal technique, continuity, or out-of-sequence experiences. First, let's look at context spatially, reveals, or out-of-context experiences. That means changing the spatial relationships. Now, this is a little bit different. Before we said we bring things into conjunction that appear to be related and they're not. Now we're saying we bring things into conjunction that are related, but then we throw it into a different context and see that the relationship is actually different. It's a slight variation. Each one is a slight variation of technique, but they have a different impact on the audience. With expectations, where we have the red herrings and it turns out not to be connected, it's just, oh, we thought this was related and it's not. When we look at the changing the context, then we say it's related but in a different way than we thought. Okay? An example of this is a cartoon by Walt Disney called Mickey's Trailer, and it's about Mickey Mouse going on vacation. When Mickey Mouse goes on vacation, it starts out with a beautiful scene. There's Mickey's trailer, and actually it's a house that he's starting in. And there's a picket fence around it, and an awning, and a flower garden, and the sun's coming up, and there's white puffy clouds, and a blue sky, and everything's just gorgeous. Green grass. Mickey comes out of the front door. He yawns, he looks around, the music is very pastoral. And then he reaches over and he pushes a button. And the picket fence rolls up and goes back inside. And the lawn rolls up and goes back inside. And the awning folds in, and it turns out that it's actually a trailer rather than a house sitting in front of this beautiful pastoral scene. And we say, oh, that's funny. And then he pushes another button, and the whole scenery folds up and back into his trailer, and he's sitting in the middle of a dump. And that was just the background that he brought with him in his trailer. It's one of its mechanical devices. Well, when this happens, all those things that we saw were related to the trailer. They're still connected to it, but now what it meant is different because we've thrown it into a larger context. So, one of the interesting things that happens is that there are certain things that you see in real life, like if someone slaps a small child, you get really, really upset that this adult is slapping a small child, and you might even run over to intervene. But if you then found out that there was a black widow spider crawling on this child's cheek, and the only way to get it and keep it from biting the kid was to slap it, suddenly a service was done to the child, and the child was being protected. So seeing a larger scope says there's a relationship. The child was indeed slapped, but the meaning of it changes when we get more information. That's called in psychology, when you make that kind of a quote-unquote mistake, a primary attribution error. Now, the mistake that I think they make in psychology is calling it an error, because it's not an error in making that judgment with the limited information you have. And since all of us have limited information because we can't possibly know everything about everything, as a result, we would be constantly making primary attribution errors in real life, which means that we're all erring every step of the way. Personally, although that may work for some outlooks on life that we're completely guilty all the time, I like to think that we're always doing the best we can and can't be held at fault for that, so I don't like thinking of it as a primary attribution error at all. Just primary attribution would be good enough for me. Well, the temporal equivalent of that is out-of-sequence experiences, changing the temporal relationships, putting things in an order that the audience thinks is the order they actually occurred, but that's not the actual order, like Pulp Fiction, for example. In Pulp Fiction, you end up having scenes occur which appear to be telling a story in a particular order, in an ordinary fashion. Later on, we start seeing things that obviously must have happened before things we already saw. And that becomes the pattern. And we start to say, oh, we have to start taking these pieces and putting it into earlier areas, and that changes the meaning of everything that came after that, so we have to keep reevaluating everything we've already seen as new information is put ahead of it. Another good example is a movie called Betrayal, starring Ben Kingsley. In Betrayal, it's a 4-act structure. The first act plays along, and you see what people do and whether they're good or bad, and you like them or don't like them because of how they react to each other and who's causing trouble for everyone else. And after the first act, then we begin the second act, and only then realize that the second act actually occurred before the first act, that it was taken out of order. Well, when this happens, we now see what led up to the beginning of the first act, and in seeing that, we realize that there were other causes we weren't aware of because of the way people were reacting. And therefore, causally, we now reevaluate who's a good guy, who's a bad guy, and who is acting properly or inappropriately. Go to the third act, and it turns out that came before the other two that we've already seen. And the fourth act came before them all. Only by the time we finally see the end of the fourth act, in terms of the order in which it's related, do we actually understand what everything we've already seen means, because that gives us our final clue as to who really started the trouble and whether people were legitimate down the line in responding the way they did. That kind of playing with causal relationships is absolutely okay. There's nothing wrong with it. It excites the audience. The only important thing is, the only caveat is, that the audience must be able to put the pieces back together when they have gotten to the end of the story, so they know what the real order was. Otherwise, the meaning of the story will be lost. So now we have our out-of-context experiences, where we say things are related, but just in a different way because we see a larger context. And out-of-sequence experiences, where things are related, but just in a different order, because now we see that we've been presented them in an order other than the order in which they occurred.